Get in my wagon now. The wealthy rancher's words echoed across the dusty parking lot as he stood before the homeless mother of three. His next move would stun everyone who witnessed it that day. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. John Smith's boots hit the frosted earth of Hollow Trace just as dusk painted the valley in cold gold. The rancher pulled his coat tighter against the biting wind, his weathered face revealing years of hard work and solitude. He paused outside Murphy's barn, his sharp eyes catching movement behind the warped boards. The structure, once sturdy and proud, now sagged under winter's weight, much like the spirits of those seeking shelter within its dubious protection. "Get in my wagon now," his voice, gruff yet warm, reverberated through the evening air. The words weren't harsh, despite their directness. They carried an unmistakable note of concern. Inside the dilapidated barn, Maria Johnson clutched her three children closer, heart pounding against her ribs. 8 months widowed, with nothing left but the shreds of her dignity and her late husband's worn boots. She hesitated. Tommy, her eldest, pressed against her side, while little Anna buried her face in the folds of Maria's tattered dress. Baby Samuel whimpered softly in her arms, his tiny body shivering despite the layers of fabric she'd wrapped him in. "Please, just leave us be," Maria called out, her voice betraying the exhaustion of endless days spent searching for work and nights spent fighting the cold. The proud woman had never imagined ending up here, homeless, desperate, and hiding in someone else's property. John stepped closer to the barn entrance, his silhouette framed by the dying light. "Ma'am, I mean no disrespect, but that little one needs warmth. They all do." He gestured toward his vehicle waiting nearby. "My ranch is 3 miles east. You'll have food and proper beds tonight." Maria's mind raced with conflicting thoughts. Stories circulated about John Smith, his wealth, his generosity, but also his reclusiveness since losing his wife. Could she trust this stranger? Yet the memory of Tommy going to sleep hungry the previous night tore at her resolve. "I don't accept charity," she whispered, torn between fear of indebtedness and the bitter ache of her children's hunger. The rancher's expression softened. "It's not charity between neighbors. It's what Daniel would have wanted." Maria's breath caught. "You knew my husband?" "Every man in 3 counties knew Daniel Johnson. Hardest worker I ever hired." John extended his hand. "One night. That's all I'm asking you to accept." Tommy looked up at his mother, his young eyes too old for his years. Anna peeked cautiously from behind Maria's skirt. With trembling fingers, Maria gathered their only possession, a small bundle containing Daniel's mended shirt and a faded photograph. The weight of her pride battled against the responsibility of motherhood. Finally, with a barely perceptible nod, she stepped forward, carrying Samuel and guiding her other children toward the waiting wagon. Inside the barn's dim shadows, Tommy Johnson pressed his thin body against Maria, shielding baby Samuel, while Anna, barely 5, buried her face in her mother's patched skirt. The children's shivers echoed Maria's own desperation. The empty biscuit tin in her hands felt heavier than lead. "Mama, I'm cold," Anna whispered, her small fingers clutching the worn fabric of Maria's only dress. 8 months since Daniel's passing had stripped them of everything: their home, their dignity, and nearly their hope. Only the occasional kindness of strangers had kept them alive as they moved from town to town, seeking work that never materialized. John Smith's gaze, known throughout Hollow Trace for its icy resolve when negotiating cattle prices, softened as he looked at the family huddled before him. The rancher's broad shoulders blocked what little moonlight filtered through the barn's weathered boards. His presence filled the space, not with threat, but with an unexpected gentleness. "Your Daniel Johnson was a good man," he said, invoking the memory of Maria's husband. "Helped me round up strays during that terrible blizzard 3 winters back. Never asked for extra pay, though he deserved it." In that moment, the distance between the richest man in 3 counties and the most powerless woman vanished. Maria's eyes welled with tears she couldn't afford to shed. Daniel had mentioned working for a wealthy rancher once, but she'd never connected that employer to the formidable John Smith, whose name was spoken with reverence throughout the valley. Tommy straightened slightly, pride momentarily overcoming fear at the mention of his father. "Pa taught me to rope," he said, voice barely audible. The rancher nodded solemnly. "He was skilled with a lasso. Best I'd seen." John knelt down, bringing himself to the boy's eye level. A man who could throw a rope like that would want his family taken care of. Samuel whimpered softly in Maria's arms, his tiny body too weak from hunger to even cry properly anymore. The infant's distress seemed to settle something in John's expression. "Mrs. Johnson," he said, his voice gentle but firm, "that offer stands. My wagon's outside. Rosa has supper waiting, and there's plenty of room." He glanced at the children, noting their hollow cheeks and the two prominent bones in their small wrists. No strings attached, just neighbors helping neighbors. Maria swallowed hard. Pride warred with maternal instinct as Anna's stomach growled audibly in the silence. The widow clutched her children closer, feeling the weight of Daniel's absence and the responsibility he'd left her with. "Why would you help us?" she asked, suspicion born of desperation edging her voice. John Smith stood, his silhouette tall against the barn door. "Because someone once helped me," he answered simply, "and because it's what decent folks do." Maria Johnson stood frozen in the barn's shadows, her mind racing. The rancher's offer hung in the air between them. Her pride, the last possession she truly owned, screamed at her to refuse. 8 months of widowhood had taught her that charity often came with invisible strings attached, especially from powerful men. She glanced down at her children, their hollow cheeks and trusting eyes telling a story she couldn't ignore. Tommy's ribs pressed visibly against his thin shirt. Anna's fingers were blue with cold. Baby Samuel whimpered softly against her chest, his cries growing weaker each day. The gnawing hunger that had become her constant companion seemed almost bearable compared to theirs. "I've heard stories," Maria whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind whistling through the barn's wooden slats. Stories whispered between women at the well, tales of desperate widows accepting help from wealthy men, some ending in servitude or shame, others in unexpected kindness. Which path would John Smith's offer lead down? The rancher shifted his weight, his tall frame blocking the last rays of sunlight streaming through the barn door. "Your husband worked my north pasture 3 summers ago," he said quietly. "Daniel was an honest man. He'd want his family safe." The mention of her late husband's name sent a jolt through Maria's heart. She clutched Daniel's worn boots closer to her chest, the last remnant of the life they built together. "I can't pay you," she said, lifting her chin despite the shame burning her cheeks. John's expression softened unexpectedly. "You're not imposing. You're accepting help from a neighbor." His voice, though firm, carried an unexpected gentleness. "Hollow Trace takes care of its own." Something in his eyes, a flicker of understanding beyond mere pity, made Maria hesitate. Behind the wealth and power that made him the most formidable man in 3 counties, she glimpsed a loneliness that mirrored her own. The loss of his wife Clara had been the talk of the town years ago. Tommy tugged at her skirt, his small face turned up to hers in silent question. Anna pressed closer, her thin shoulders trembling with cold. "Just for tonight," Maria finally said, her voice trembling with both surrender and determination. "Just until the storm passes." John nodded, a brief smile crossing his weathered face. He extended a calloused hand toward the barn door, toward his waiting wagon. "That's all I'm asking for now." As Maria gathered her children and their meager belongings, she couldn't help but wonder if this single decision, born of desperation and a mother's love, would change everything. The wooden wagon creaked along Main Street, drawing every eye in Hollow Trace. John Smith's distinctive vehicle was known throughout the county, a symbol of wealth and position that now carried an unexpected cargo. Maria Johnson sat rigidly beside him, her 3 children huddled close, all wrapped in thick wool blankets that still carried the faint scent of cedar from John's storage chest. "They're watching," Maria whispered, her voice barely audible above the steady clip-clop of the horse's hooves. She didn't need to elaborate. Behind lace curtains and shop windows, townsfolk peered without shame, their expressions ranging from curiosity to outright judgment. John kept his eyes forward, his jaw set in that determined way that had intimidated many a business rival. "Let them," he replied simply. The whispers spread faster than wildfire in August. Eliza Peterson, the milliner's wife, practically flew from her shop to the general store, breathless with news. "John Smith has taken in that Johnson widow and her brood." By the time the wagon reached the edge of town, the telegraph of gossip had reached every household in Hollow Trace. "That poor man's lost his mind with grief," muttered old Mr. Finch from his porch rocker. "Or found something else entirely," countered his wife with a knowing look. Maria felt each stare like a physical touch. Her cheeks burned hot despite the winter chill, and she pulled her threadbare shawl tighter, as if it might shield her from the town's scrutiny. 8 months a widow, and now this, riding beside the wealthiest man in 3 counties, accepting charity she'd sworn never to take. Daniel would understand, wouldn't he? The thought of her late husband brought fresh pain, but the hollow eyes of her children had finally outweighed her pride. Tommy, her eldest, sat transfixed by the plush leather seat beneath him, a luxury beyond imagination after weeks of sleeping on straw. Anna's small fingers traced the intricate stitching on her borrowed blanket, while baby Samuel had finally stopped crying, lulled by the gentle rocking of the carriage. "Is your house very big?" Tommy asked suddenly, breaking the tense silence. John's stern expression softened momentarily. "Big enough for all of you," he answered, his voice gentler than Maria had yet heard it. As they left the town behind, the road wound upward toward the sprawling Smith Ranch. The children's eyes widened at the sight of actual cushioned seats beneath them, at the well-fed horses pulling them forward, at the promise of warmth that awaited. For them, this journey represented possibility, comfort they'd forgotten existed. For Maria, it represented uncertainty, shame, and a desperate gamble. But as the ranch house appeared on the horizon, golden light spilling from its windows into the gathering dusk, she allowed herself one dangerous moment of hope. The Smith Ranch stretched across the valley like a kingdom unto itself, its sturdy fences and sprawling pastures a testament to years of toil and heartbreak. As twilight descended, the main house stood proudly against the darkening sky, windows aglow with warm lamplight that beckoned through the gathering dusk. John Smith brought the wagon to a gentle stop in the courtyard, the horse's breath visible in the cold evening air. Maria Johnson hesitated before accepting John's outstretched hand. Her children huddled together on the wagon seat, wide-eyed at the sight of such grandeur. Tommy clutched baby Samuel protectively while Anna clung to her mother's skirt, her small fingers trembling not just from cold, but from uncertainty. "It's all right," John said, his voice softer than Maria expected from such a formidable man. "You're safe here." The rancher helped each child down with surprising gentleness, his large hands steady as he lifted Samuel from Tommy's arms. The baby regarded him with solemn eyes before nestling against his broad chest, an unexpected trust that made Maria's throat tighten. As they approached the house, the front door swung open, spilling golden light across the porch. Rosa stood in the doorway, her silver-streaked hair pulled back in a practical bun, her apron spotless despite the day's work. The housekeeper's initial expression of curiosity quickly transformed as she took in the sight of the bedraggled family. "Mr. Smith?" she questioned, her eyes moving from her employer to the unexpected guests. "They'll be staying with us, Rosa," John explained, his tone matter-of-fact as he crossed the threshold, still cradling Samuel. Rosa's gaze swept over Maria's patched dress, Tommy's too-thin frame, and Anna's dirt-smudged face. Her weathered features softened immediately. "Guests for the Blue Room, Mr. Smith?" she asked, already moving toward the staircase. "Of course," John replied, his tone brooking no argument. "And perhaps some hot soup and bread for everyone." Maria felt her cheeks burn with shame at their obvious need, but Rosa's gentle efficiency left no room for embarrassment. The housekeeper simply nodded, her experienced eyes already assessing what was required. "The Blue Room has the morning sun," Rosa explained to Maria, leading the way upstairs. "And it's closest to the washroom. The children will sleep well there." Tommy looked around in wonder at the polished banisters and framed landscapes that lined the hallway, while Anna stayed close to her mother, overwhelmed by the sudden change in their circumstances. Maria clutched Daniel's boots to her chest like a shield, the last remnant of her former life, feeling increasingly out of place in these grand surroundings. Behind them, John followed with Samuel, his expression unreadable as he watched the family take their first tentative steps into his home. Maria Johnson sat on the edge of the unfamiliar bed, her fingers tracing the intricate patterns of the quilt, finer than anything she'd touched in years. The Blue Room, as Rosa had called it, was bathed in soft lamplight that cast gentle shadows across walls that had likely never known the desperation she carried. Her first night at Smith Ranch felt like stepping into someone else's dream. Just hours ago, she and her children had been huddled in Murphy's barn, the cold seeping through worn blankets, hunger gnawing at their bellies. Now, her 3 little ones were clean, fed, and tucked into beds with pillows that cradled their heads like clouds. Maria moved to the window, drawing back the heavy curtain to stare at the vastness of John's property. Moonlight silvered the pastures that stretched toward distant hills. A sob caught in her throat, not of sorrow, but of overwhelming relief mixed with shame. Daniel would never have wanted this for them, begging for scraps of kindness from strangers. She pressed her palm against the cool glass, tears streaming silently down her cheeks. The ranch house was so quiet compared to the constant vigilance of their homeless existence. No need to listen for approaching footsteps or stray dogs. No wind whistling through barn boards. The floorboards creaked softly behind her. Tommy stood in his borrowed nightshirt, his thin frame silhouetted in the moonlight, dark hair tousled from restless sleep. "Mama, are we safe now?" he whispered, his young voice carrying the weight of months spent protecting his siblings from harsh realities. Maria quickly wiped her tears and opened her arms. Her eldest child, only 7 years old but with eyes that had seen too much, crossed the room and leaned into her embrace. She smoothed his dark hair, so like his father's, and felt her heart constrict with love and worry. "Come," she whispered, leading him to where Anna and baby Samuel slept. Anna's small form was curled protectively around her baby brother, her face peaceful for the first time in months. Tommy climbed onto the bed, and Maria gathered all 3 children close, forming a protective circle of arms and whispered promises. "Just for tonight, sweetheart," she murmured into Tommy's hair. "Tonight we're safe." But even as she spoke the words, Maria felt the dangerous tendrils of hope taking root. The warmth of the Blue Room, the clean sheets that smelled of sunshine, and the memory of John Smith's kind eyes as he'd shown them to their quarters, all conspired to make her wonder if safety might last beyond sunrise. She kissed each child's forehead and settled back against the headboard, unwilling to surrender to sleep and lose even a moment of this precious respite. For tonight, her children's bellies were full. For tonight they were warm. For tonight they were safe. Tomorrow's worries could wait until dawn. Down the hall, John Smith stood motionless at his bedroom window, watching moonlight spill across the vast expanse of his ranch. The property stretched for miles, a testament to his success, yet tonight it felt like nothing more than an empty kingdom. His calloused fingers gripped the windowsill as memories of Clara threatened to pull him under like a riptide. "It's been 4 years," he whispered to the darkness, recalling his wife's gentle smile and the way she'd laugh when he'd come in from the fields covered in dust. 4 years since the fever had taken both her and their unborn child within a week's time. The rancher closed his eyes, feeling the familiar weight of grief pressing against his chest. But then, a sound, faint at first, then clearer. Children's laughter drifted through the thick walls of the house, muffled yet unmistakable. Tommy's deeper chuckle followed by Anna's high-pitched giggle. John turned his head toward the sound, something stirring inside him that had lain dormant for years. The wealthy man moved across the room, his footsteps silent on the polished wooden floor. He paused before the oak dresser where Clara's possessions remained exactly as she had left them. With deliberate movements, he pulled open the top drawer, a ritual he had performed countless nights since her passing. Inside, nestled in a small velvet pouch, lay Clara's wedding ring. The gold band caught the moonlight as he stared down at it, remembering how it had gleamed on her slender finger. Every night for 4 years, he had opened this drawer, touched the ring, and spoken to her as if she might answer. Tonight was different. John's hand hovered over the pouch, then slowly withdrew. For the first time since her death, he closed the drawer without touching the precious object. The sound of Samuel's happy babbling from down the hall seemed to give him permission. "Perhaps it's time," he murmured, turning back toward the window. The vast ranch no longer looked quite so empty. Lights glowed in windows that had been dark for too long. The blue room, where Maria Johnson and her children now slept, had been a guest room Clara had prepared for their own child, a room that had remained untouched until today. John exhaled slowly, feeling something crack and shift within his chest. Not forgetting, never forgetting, but perhaps making room for something new. The possibility of voices filling these hollow spaces again, of purpose beyond merely existing. As he prepared for bed, the rancher found himself listening for those distant sounds of life, letting the possibility of a future, not just a past, fill the quiet house. As the first light of dawn filtered through the curtains, Maria Johnson sat on the edge of the bed, her hands methodically folding the few garments they possessed. 8 days had passed since John Smith had found them in Murphy's barn. 8 days of warmth, food, and safety that felt both like a blessing and a burden. She reached for Daniel's boots, worn at the heels and cracked along the sides. These leather remnants were all that remained of the man who had promised to build her a life. Maria ran her fingers along the rough edges, remembering how Daniel would kick them off at the door, his laugh filling their modest home before tragedy struck. The boots represented everything: her pride, her loss, her reluctance to accept charity that might strip away her last shred of independence. "We've stayed too long already," she whispered to herself, though the thought of returning to the cold uncertainty made her stomach tighten. Better to leave now, she reasoned, before John's kindness faded, or worse, before the children became too attached to comforts they couldn't keep. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Maria hastily wiped her eyes and opened the door to find John standing there, little Samuel cradled against his broad chest. The baby's tiny fingers clutched the rancher's shirt with surprising strength, his round face peaceful in sleep. "He was fussing," John explained, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. "Rosa thought he might need his mother, but he settled as soon as I picked him up." Maria reached for her son, but hesitated when she saw how naturally he rested in John's arms. The wealthy rancher, known throughout 3 counties for his shrewd business sense, looked transformed with a child against his heart. "Rosa has breakfast nearly ready," he continued, noticing the half-packed bundle on the bed. His eyes, usually sharp as winter frost, showed a flicker of something that might have been disappointment. The children are already awake. Tommy's helping collect eggs, and Anna's watching Rosa make biscuits. Maria glanced at her meager preparations for departure. "We shouldn't impose. Stay a little longer," John urged, the unexpected tenderness in his voice catching her off guard. "At least through breakfast. The children." He paused, looking down at Samuel. "They seem happy here." The unspoken question hung between them. "Couldn't you be happy here too?" Maria's hands fell away from her packing. One more meal, she told herself. One more hour of warmth before facing the world again. She nodded slowly, and the smile that crossed John's weathered face made her wonder if perhaps there was something more than charity behind his invitation. The kitchen at Smith Ranch pulsed with life that morning. Rosa moved with practiced efficiency between the cast-iron stove and the large oak table, her sleeves rolled up as she tended to sizzling eggs and flipped golden biscuits. The aroma of fresh coffee mingled with the sweet scent of maple syrup, creating an atmosphere of comfort that felt almost foreign to Maria Johnson after months of uncertainty. Anna Johnson's eyes grew wide as saucers when Rosa placed the second helping of scrambled eggs before her. The 5-year-old glanced at her mother, seeking permission, her tiny fingers already inching toward her fork. Maria nodded with a lump in her throat, watching as her daughter attacked the food with renewed enthusiasm. Tommy, who had barely spoken more than necessary since his father's passing, sat with his back straight, methodically cutting his food into perfect squares. John Smith noticed the boy's careful approach and gently commented, "Good technique there, son. My father taught me to eat just like that." The rancher's words seemed to relax something in Tommy's shoulders, and he offered a fleeting smile before returning to his task. Baby Samuel, secured in a cushioned chair Rosa had pulled from storage, giggled as milk dribbled down his chin. The white mustache it left made John chuckle, a sound that seemed to surprise even him. "Looks like we've got ourselves a little cowboy in training," he remarked, dabbing the baby's face with a cloth napkin. Maria felt her cheeks warm as she observed the scene. The shame of accepting charity battled with overwhelming gratitude for this moment of normalcy. Her children were eating their fill, laughing, being children again, something she had feared might never happen after Daniel's death. "More coffee?" Rosa asked, her tone matter-of-fact, but her eyes kind, as she held the steaming pot over Maria's cup. "Thank you," Maria whispered, noticing how the housekeeper had already learned that she preferred her coffee with just a touch of cream. John sat at the head of the table, his presence solid and reassuring. He didn't press conversation, but offered quiet encouragements. A nod when Tommy finished his plate, a wink when Anna managed to pour her own milk without spilling. His weathered hands, more accustomed to ranch work than breakfast tables, seemed gentler somehow in this morning light. Rosa's teasing voice broke through Maria's thoughts. "Miss Anna, if you keep eating like that, you'll soon be tall enough to help me reach the top shelf." The little girl giggled, revealing a gap where her front tooth had recently fallen out. In this moment, with laughter filling the once silent kitchen, the boundaries between temporary shelter and permanent home, between strangers and family, began to blur in ways that both comforted and terrified Maria Johnson. After breakfast, Maria found John on the porch, his weathered hands moving methodically across the leather-bound ledger. Jack Brown stood beside him, the loyal foreman's face creased with concentration as they discussed cattle counts and feed supplies for the coming weeks. The morning sun cast long shadows across the wooden planks, highlighting the prosperity of Smith Ranch, a world so different from her recent existence in Murphy's barn. Maria hesitated at the doorway, gathering her courage before approaching. "Mr. Smith," she began, her voice soft but determined, "I need to thank you properly for your kindness to my children and me." John looked up, his eyes crinkling slightly at the corners. "But you're planning to leave," he stated, rather than asked, setting down his pencil. Jack nodded respectfully to Maria, before excusing himself. sensing the private nature of their conversation. The foreman's boots made hollow sounds against the porch steps as he retreated toward the stables. "We've imposed enough." Friends in Hollow Trace had their own struggles, and winter was settling in with unforgiving certainty. "I'll find work," she insisted, though her voice lacked conviction. "Perhaps in the next town. I can sew, cook." "With 3 young children?" John rose from his chair, his tall frame casting a shadow across the porch. "Tommy needs schooling. Anna's just beginning to smile again. And Samuel?" He paused, his expression softening. "That boy needs stability." Maria felt tears threatening. "I will live on charity." "This isn't about charity," John countered, his voice firm but kind. "Maybe accepting help isn't about pride at all. Maybe it's honoring Daniel's wish that his family be taken care of." The mention of her late husband's name made Maria's breath catch. She remembered Daniel's final days, his desperate concern not for himself, but for them. "Daniel was a good man," John continued. "He helped me once years ago when a flash flood nearly took my east pasture. Never asked for anything in return." Maria hadn't known this. Daniel had never mentioned helping the wealthiest rancher in the county. The revelation shifted something inside her, creating space for possibility where before there had only been desperation. "Stay through winter," John suggested, his tone making it clear this wasn't merely charity, but something more complex. "The children need time. So do you." Maria looked across the vast expanse of Smith Ranch, feeling the weight of decision pressing upon her shoulders. For the first time in months, the future held something beyond mere survival. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Smith Ranch as Maria Johnson stood on the porch, watching John and Jack Brown discuss the day's work. The ranch hands moved purposefully through the yard, their voices carrying on the crisp air. She found herself admiring the quiet efficiency of the operation, so different from the chaos of her recent life. A piercing neigh shattered the peaceful scene. Maria's heart stopped as she spotted Tommy wandering dangerously close to the corral where a spirited chestnut mare pawed the ground nervously. Before she could scream a warning, the animal reared, hooves slashing the air mere inches from her son's face. John Smith moved with astonishing speed. One moment he was beside Jack reviewing ledgers, the next he was vaulting over the porch railing. In 3 powerful strides, he reached Tommy, scooping the boy into his arms and pivoting away as the mare's hooves struck the ground where the child had stood seconds before. "Tommy!" Maria cried, rushing forward, her legs weak with terror. The rancher held her son securely against his chest, his breathing barely accelerated despite the sprint. Tommy's eyes were wide with shock rather than fear, his small hands clutching John's shirt. "Easy there, Firefly," John murmured to the agitated horse, his voice low and steady. The mare's ears flicked forward at the familiar tone, her dancing steps gradually slowing. She didn't mean harm, just startled is all. Maria reached them, hands trembling as she checked her son for injuries. "Are you hurt? What were you thinking, wandering so close?" "I just wanted to pet her," Tommy whispered, his voice small. "She looked friendly." John set the boy down gently, but kept a protective hand on his shoulder. "Firefly is friendly, but she's also skittish with strangers. Trust takes time," he explained, kneeling to meet Tommy at eye level. "Horses are like people that way. You need to earn their confidence." His gaze lifted to Maria's face, and something unspoken passed between them. The words weren't just about the mare. They were about all of them, about the fragile new connections forming in this unexpected arrangement. "Would you like to learn how to approach her properly?" John asked Tommy, whose face brightened immediately. "Can I, Mama?" he asked, already recovering from the scare with a child's resilience. Maria nodded, watching as John guided her son's hand, showing him how to let the horse catch his scent. The rancher's patience was evident in every careful movement, in the gentle instructions he offered. This wasn't just kindness, it was something deeper, something that made her chest tighten with emotions she wasn't ready to name. John glanced back at her, his expression gentle but resolute. The message was clear. Healing and belonging would not happen overnight. But he was willing to wait. The fire crackled in the stone hearth, casting dancing shadows across the parlor, as Maria Johnson sat opposite John Smith. With the children finally asleep upstairs, an unusual quiet settled between them. Maria's fingers absently traced the worn fabric of the armchair, her mind still processing the day's events, especially Tommy's narrow escape from the mayor. "Daniel always dreamed of a proper home for us," she said softly, breaking the silence. "Not just shelter, but somewhere the children could put down roots." Her voice caught. "But if we stay, it must be on my terms. I won't be a burden to you or anyone else." John leaned forward, his weathered hands clasped together. The firelight softened his usually stern features, revealing the compassion that had first prompted him to stop at Murphy's barn 8 days ago. "You could never be a burden," he replied, his voice low and earnest. "But the children deserve more than just a roof. They need stability, education, friends their own age." Maria watched the flames, remembering how Anna had marveled at the ranch house, touching everything as if it might disappear. How Tommy had slept through the night for the first time in months. "There's a good school in town," John continued. "Miss Wilson is a friend. She's strict but fair. Tommy's quick mind would flourish there. The children could start after Thanksgiving. Give them time to settle in." "And what would I do while they're learning?" Maria asked, her pride still a formidable barrier. "I won't be a charity case living off your generosity." The rancher smiled slightly. "Rosa could use help with the household accounts. She's magnificent with cooking and managing the staff, but numbers give her headaches." He gestured toward the ledgers on his desk. "And I've seen how you calculate supplies in your head faster than Jack can write them down." Maria felt a flicker of hope, an actual skill she could contribute, not just endless gratitude. "This isn't charity," John added, as if reading her thoughts. "It's partnership. The ranch needs more than just my direction to thrive." Outside, wind rattled the windows as winter tightened its grip on Hollow Trace. Inside, something fragile and new began taking shape between them. "Until spring," Maria finally said. "We'll stay until spring, and then reassess." John nodded, not pushing further. "Until spring." He agreed, raising his cup of coffee in a small toast. Neither mentioned how, by spring, the roots they were all putting down might be too deep to easily pull up. Some truths were better left unspoken, at least for now. Maria Johnson sat across from John in the parlor, her fingers nervously tracing the worn fabric of her dress. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting long shadows across the room as she finally gathered the courage to ask what had been weighing on her mind. "Why are you doing all this for us?" she questioned, her voice barely above a whisper. "A wealthy man like you has no obligation to a widow and her children." John Smith's weathered face softened in the firelight. He looked down at his hands, strong hands that had built an empire, but couldn't save his wife. When he spoke, his words carried the raw honesty of a man who had kept his pain locked away for too long. "After Clara died," he began, his voice catching slightly, "this house became nothing but a tomb of memories. Every room, every corner, held her ghost." He gestured around the parlor. "I'd walk these halls at night, surrounded by everything I'd worked for, yet completely alone." Maria watched as he stood and moved toward the mantelpiece, where a small silver frame held a portrait of a smiling woman. Clara's image seemed to watch over them both. "The first night Tommy laughed at dinner," John continued, "it was like hearing music after years of silence. When Anna sang to herself while drawing by the window." He paused, collecting himself. "Those sounds don't belong in a mausoleum. They belong in a home." The rancher turned to face her, his expression vulnerable in a way Maria had never seen before. "I'm not looking for a replacement for Clara, if that's what you're worried about. What we had can't be replaced, just as what you had with Daniel can't be. Maria nodded, understanding the shared grief that connected them despite their different circumstances. But having you and the children here, John admitted, makes this place feel like a home again, instead of just a house filled with possessions. For the first time in years, I remember why I built all this in the first place. The widow felt tears prickling behind her eyes. We can't stay forever, she whispered, though the thought of leaving brought an unexpected ache. Stay until spring, John suggested, his tone gentle but hopeful. Give the children time to grow stronger. Give yourself time to decide what comes next. Maria looked into the fire, weighing his words against her pride. Finally, she nodded. Until spring, then. As they sat in comfortable silence, the promise of routine and safety settled over the ranch like the gentle snowfall beginning outside the window, covering old wounds and creating a clean slate, if only for a season. The weeks that followed found Maria rising before dawn, her body adjusting to the rhythms of ranch life with surprising ease. Each morning, she would pause at the window of the blue room, watching the sun paint hollow trace in shades of gold and promise. The once terrifying expanse of John Smith's property now felt like a sanctuary. In the kitchen, Rosa watched with critical eyes what began as tense instruction gradually softened into companionable work. By the third week, Rosa had silently ceded the eastern corner of the kitchen counter to Maria, a territorial concession that spoke volumes. Your mother's biscuits might be better than mine, Rosa admitted one morning, sampling Maria's handiwork with grudging approval. Maria's cheeks flushed with pride as she tucked the compliment away like a precious coin. John, too, underwent a transformation. The rancher who once ate in monastic silence now found himself bombarded with Tommy's endless questions about cattle brands and the proper way to mend fence lines. Why do we use this kind of wood? The boy would ask, his small fingers tracing the grain of a fence post. John's patient explanations grew longer, his voice warmer with each passing day. At dinner, Anna's cheerful chatter about barn cats and chicken eggs filled the dining room. The speckled hen laid 2 eggs today, she would announce proudly, as if reporting vital ranch business. Samuel, growing plumper by the day, babbled from his high chair, smacking the wooden tray with delight. Jack Brown noticed the change in his employer during their morning rides. Never seen you smile so much checking cattle, the foreman remarked one frosty morning. John merely nodded, but the truth hung between them. The house that had stood like a mausoleum to grief was remembering how to sing. In the evenings, Maria would often find John in the parlor, ledger open but forgotten, as he listened to the children's bedtime routine upstairs. The floorboards would creak with small footsteps, punctuated by giggles and the occasional squeal. They're settling in well, Maria said one night, her hands busy with mending. John closed his ledger. So are you, he replied simply. The house absorbed these new patterns. Boots by the door in varying sizes, children's drawings tacked to the pantry door, a woman's humming in rooms long silent, and slowly the Smith Ranch began to breathe again. The kitchen table became a schoolroom each morning after breakfast. Maria Johnson watched with quiet pride as Tommy hunched over his slate, his brow furrowed in concentration. The boy who had once been too hungry to focus now calculated sums faster than she could check them. "Look at this, Mama," Tommy would exclaim, holding up his work. His natural aptitude for mathematics surprised everyone, especially John, who began teaching him how to calculate cattle prices and feed quantities. Anna, sitting across from her brother, rarely spoke during these sessions. Instead, her small fingers worked charcoal across scraps of paper Rosa had saved. What began as simple shapes evolved into recognizable drawings of the ranch, horses in the corral, chickens in the yard, even a remarkably accurate portrait of Samuel sleeping in his makeshift cradle. "She has a gift," Rosa whispered to Maria one morning, carefully setting aside Anna's latest creation. My sister in town sells drawings to travelers. Perhaps someday. Samuel, meanwhile, transformed before their eyes, his once hollow cheeks rounded with health, his thin limbs growing stronger each day. He began crawling with surprising speed, chasing after the kitchen cat and pulling himself up on furniture, leaving a trail of cheerful destruction that no one had the heart to scold. Afternoons brought a different rhythm to the ranch. Tommy would trail after John Smith like a shadow, learning to mend broken fence posts and check water troughs. Maria often paused in her work to watch them through the window. The tall rancher patiently demonstrating how to hold tools properly, her son's eager nods and careful imitation. "He's a natural," John told her one evening, his voice carrying a warmth that made Maria's heart flutter unexpectedly. "Remembers everything I show him." Anna found her place supervising the chicken coop, counting eggs with solemn importance and naming each hen. Maria herself settled into new routines, mending clothes by the fire, helping Rosa prepare meals for the ranch hands, her hands finally busy with creation rather than mere survival. One crisp afternoon, John returned from town with packages wrapped in brown paper. For Anna, colored pencils that made her eyes widen in disbelief. For Samuel, a soft stuffed bear that he immediately tried to eat. For Tommy, John had saved something special. From his pocket, he withdrew a wooden horse, its details lovingly carved by hand. "Made it myself," he said simply, as Tommy stared in wordless wonder. The boy's face, transformed by such a simple gift, nearly broke Maria's heart. She turned away, blinking back tears, remembering how little it had taken to make her son happy before, and how much he deserved this moment of pure joy. The crackling fire cast dancing shadows across the parlor, as Maria Johnson sat beside John Smith on the worn leather settee. Outside, snow had begun to fall, blanketing the Smith ranch in a pristine white coat that muffled the world beyond the windows. The children had been tucked in hours ago, their excited chatter about tomorrow's promised sledding adventure finally giving way to peaceful slumber. "I found Tommy's drawings under his pillow today," Maria said softly, her fingers absently tracing the pattern on her teacup. "He's drawn all of us, you, me, Anna, Samuel, even Rosa and Jack, standing in front of this house." She paused, her voice catching. "He's labeled it home." John nodded, his weathered face softening in the firelight. "Anna asked me yesterday if she could plant flowers come spring. Said she wants to see them from the blue room window." "That's what worries me," Maria confessed, setting her cup down. "They're getting attached." Fear threaded through her words, mingling with the undeniable hope that had taken root in her heart. "What happens when what?" John interrupted gently, his eyes reflecting the dancing flames. "When spring comes, when the arrangement ends." Maria looked away, unable to face the question that had haunted her these past weeks. The rancher reached across the space between them, his calloused hand covering hers with surprising tenderness. "Would that be so terrible?" he asked. "Their attachment? Yours?" The question hung in the air between them, weighty with possibility. Through the frosted window, Maria watched snowflakes drift lazily downward, each one unique, each one finding its place in the growing blanket outside. "I never planned this," she whispered. "When you found us in Murphy's barn, I thought we'd stay one night, maybe two." "Life rarely follows our plans," John replied, his voice low and thoughtful. "Clara used to say that God laughs at our carefully drawn maps." Maria turned to face him, studying the lines of his face, once so stern and imposing, now familiar and dear. "The children deserve stability. They deserve to put down roots somewhere." "And you?" John asked, his question simple yet profound. "What do you deserve, Maria?" She had no answer, but as the snow continued to fall outside, transforming the landscape into something new and beautiful, Maria felt something shift within her. like frozen ground beginning to thaw after a long winter. The possibility of a new family, unexpected and unplanned, was taking root in the wintry silence of the ranch house, as natural and inevitable as the changing seasons. Winter settled over Hollow Trace like a thick blanket, transforming the Smith Ranch into a haven of warmth against the biting cold. Inside the sturdy house, Maria Johnson found herself humming as she dusted off a leather-bound book discovered in one of the kitchen cupboards. Her fingers traced the faded script on the cover, her mother's recipe collection, thought lost during their hasty departure from their previous home. "I never thought I'd see this again," Maria whispered, tears welling in her eyes as she flipped through pages spotted with vanilla and cinnamon stains from years past. Rosa appeared at her shoulder, her usually stern expression softening. "What treasures have you found?" The housekeeper leaned closer, examining the handwritten notes. Soon the kitchen filled with the rich aroma of molasses cookies baking in the oven, Maria's mother's special recipe that had comforted her through childhood winters. "The ranch hands will fight over these," Rosa chuckled, her initial territorial stance in the kitchen long forgotten, as she and Maria worked side by side, preparing hearty stews that steamed in the cold air when Jack Brown and the other workers came in from tending cattle. Outside, John Smith had built a small snow fort with Tommy, the boys' laughter echoing across the property. The rancher marveled at the transformation in Maria's eldest son. Once painfully thin and withdrawn, Tommy now helped with simple ranch chores, his small hands growing stronger as he learned to mend fences and care for the animals. The boy's eyes, once dulled by hunger and fear, now sparkled with curiosity and security. Anna, no longer hiding behind her mother's skirts, had blossomed under the attention of both John and Rosa. The 5-year-old collected colored ribbons from Rosa's sewing basket, creating simple but beautiful decorations for the house. Her voice, barely audible months ago, now filled the rooms with songs and stories. Perhaps most remarkable was little Samuel. The baby who had arrived at the ranch with hollow cheeks now crawled with determined energy, chasing after the family's new kitten. One evening, as John lifted him from the floor, Samuel patted the rancher's face and clearly said, "Papa John." The room had fallen silent. Maria froze by the fireplace, her eyes meeting John's over the child's dark curls. For a moment, the past and future seemed to hang in perfect balance. The memory of Daniel Johnson and the possibility of a new family taking root. "Papa John," Samuel repeated, oblivious to the emotional weight of his words. John's eyes glistened as he bounced the boy gently. "That's right, little man," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm right here." That night, after the children were asleep, Maria found John on the porch, watching the snow fall. Neither spoke of Samuel's words, but their shoulders touched as they stood together, watching winter transform their world. The whispers in Hollow Trace grew from quiet murmurs to pointed accusations as winter settled over the valley. Cornelius Blake, the local banker whose thin smile never reached his eyes, found a willing ally in Marcus Dalton, a landowner whose property bordered the Smith Ranch. Together, they circulated through town with practiced concern etched on their faces. "Have you noticed John's erratic behavior lately?" Cornelius would ask, leaning close over countertops at the general store. "Taking in vagrants, spending lavishly on another man's children." "It's not like him," Marcus would nod solemnly. "Clara's death broke something in him. A man doesn't think straight after such tragedy." Their words found fertile ground among those who had always envied John's success or resented his independence. Soon, the banker was seen carrying a leather-bound document from door to door, collecting signatures with solemn pronouncements about community responsibility and protecting a good man from himself. Maria first noticed the change when shopkeepers grew cold during her weekly trips to town. Children were pulled away from Tommy and Anna. Conversations halted when she approached. The whispers followed her like shadows. "Fortune hunter, taking advantage, Poor confused John. One bitter afternoon, Jack Brown rode hard into the ranch yard, his usually composed face tight with worry. He found John and Maria in the barn where they were teaching Samuel to pet the gentlest mare. "We've got trouble," the foreman announced, removing his hat. "Blake and Dalton have 23 signatures on a petition to the county judge. They're claiming you're mentally unfit to manage your affairs after Clara's passing." John's face hardened. "Let them try." "It's worse than that," Jack continued, his voice dropping as he glanced at Maria. "If they succeed, the court will appoint a conservator, likely Blake himself. You'd lose control of everything, the ranch, your accounts." He hesitated. "And they've specifically mentioned preventing any marriage that might be considered hasty or ill-advised." Maria felt the ground shift beneath her feet. "This is because of me," she whispered, Samuel clutching her skirt. John's hand found hers, steady and warm. "No, this is because Blake has wanted this land for years. You're just the excuse." That night, after the children were asleep, Maria paced the kitchen floor. "We could leave," she suggested, voice breaking, "return to how things were before." John's response was immediate and firm. "And prove them right? Give them exactly what they want?" He shook his head. "I won't surrender what matters most because of their greed disguised as concern." The petition sat on Blake's desk downtown, a weapon aimed at the heart of everything they had built together. The threat was real and terrifying. John Smith refused to surrender to the whispers that had grown into a roar throughout Hollow Trace. Standing in the ranch house parlor, his weathered hands gripped the petition Jack had brought, the formal challenge to his mental fitness and right to manage his affairs. "They won't take what's mine," he declared, his voice steady despite the rage burning beneath. "Not the ranch, not my dignity, and certainly not my right to choose who shares my life." Maria Johnson paced by the window, her face drawn with worry. The weight of responsibility crushed down on her shoulders. "This is because of me," she whispered. "I've brought this trouble to your doorstep." Jack Brown shook his head firmly. "Blake's been looking for ways to get his hands on this land for years. You're just the excuse he needed." By nightfall, allies had gathered in the ranch kitchen. Reverend Matthews sat at the table, his Bible-worn hands wrapped around a mug of coffee. Doc Harris, who had delivered half the town's children, nodded solemnly as John outlined their strategy. 3 longtime ranch hands, men who had worked the Smith land for over a decade, stood by the door, their loyalty unwavering. "We'll testify to your sound mind," Doc Harris assured John. "I've known you since you were knee-high to a grasshopper. No judge would question my assessment." The Reverend agreed. "The congregation stands with you. Blake may have money, but he doesn't have the people's hearts." As the men discussed legal options, Maria slipped outside. The night air bit at her skin as she stared across the darkened pastures. Tommy had found his first real happiness here. Anna laughed now, a sound Maria had almost forgotten. And little Samuel was thriving under John's gentle care. She heard the door open behind her and felt John's presence before he spoke. "You're thinking of running," he said. It wasn't a question. Maria turned, tears glistening. "I won't be the reason you lose everything you've built." John closed the distance between them, taking her hands in his. "Listen to me," he said, his voice fierce with conviction. "You're not running, and I'm not letting them take what we've built. We fight together." His intensity startled her. This wasn't charity or pity. This was a man defending his family. "The children need stability," he continued. "We need each other. And I'll be damned if I let Blake or anyone else tell me who belongs in my home." By dawn, their plan was set. A public wedding would precede the town meeting, a declaration that this union wasn't born of madness, but of choice and love. The showdown would come, but they would face it standing side by side. "Together," Maria agreed, strength returning to her voice. We fight together. The church in Hollow Trace had never seen such a gathering. Townspeople squeezed into pews, stood along walls, and craned necks from doorways as John Smith rose to address them. His shoulders squared with determination, he faced the assembly with the same resolve that had built his ranch from nothing. I stand before you not just as a rancher, but as a man who found family when he least expected it, John began, his voice steady despite the stakes. He presented his military commendations from years of service, business ledgers showing his sound judgment, and testimonials from merchants who had dealt with him for decades. Cornelius Blake shifted uncomfortably in his seat, exchanging glances with Marcus Dalton. Their petition, circulated with whispers of John's supposed instability, now seemed flimsy against the evidence of his character. The rancher saved his most powerful testimony for last. I'd like to read something written by Tommy Johnson, he said, unfolding a carefully penned letter. The boy's words, simple yet profound, described finding safety after months of fear, learning to trust again, and having a man who taught him to ride horses and count cattle. Mr. Smith doesn't just give us food, John read, his voice catching slightly. He gives us hope. That's what a father does. When Maria Johnson stepped forward, her transformation from the desperate woman in Murphy's barn was complete. Standing tall in a modest blue dress, she addressed her neighbors with quiet dignity. Some of you saw me at my lowest moment, she began, a widow with 3 hungry children and nowhere to turn. Her gaze settled on Blake and Dalton, and some of you saw an opportunity in our pain. Maria revealed how the banker had refused her loan after Daniel's death, how Dalton had tried to purchase their land for a fraction of its worth. The crowd murmured as the true motives behind the petition became clear, not concern for John's welfare, but revenge for his interference in their schemes. Reverend Matthews rose next, followed by Doc Harris and Jack Brown. One by one, they spoke of John's generosity, his sound mind, and the positive change in the Johnson children. As the meeting concluded, the petition was not merely withdrawn, it was torn to pieces. The community that had once whispered behind curtains now surrounded John and Maria with handshakes and embraces. Under the same church rafters where suspicion had gathered, John took Maria's hand. Their engagement, announced amid cheers and well wishes, transformed the Smith Ranch from a monument to past sorrows into a beacon of hope. That winter, the harshest in memory, found the newly formed family sheltered in warmth and love. Proof that family could be found in the most unexpected places, and that even the coldest seasons eventually yield to spring.